poor college student says yes to the marriage proposal of a 71-year-old billionaire woman to save his family from ruin. But once the mansion gates close behind him, he doesn't enter a marriage. He walks into a maze of secrets, revenge, and manipulation. The only question that remains: how do you escape when your very identity has been rewritten? The rain had poured relentlessly for a week, as if the small sky above the town of Houston was writhing in anguish alongside Jacob Carter's own struggles. He hurried along the slick sidewalk, his backpack weighing heavily on one shoulder, his torn shoes soaked through with rainwater. At 23, Jacob should have been living the freest days of his youth, but instead, he was shouldering the burden of a broken family after his father's sudden death. Tuition fees, his mother's hospital bills, bank debts, they were all tightening around his neck like an invisible noose. His phone buzzed in his coat pocket, an unknown number. Jacob Carter. A woman's voice came through, slow and commanding. "I'm Eleanor Brooks. I want to meet you about your financial situation." Jacob froze mid-step. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "I know enough. 7 p.m. tonight, Brooks Bistro." The call ended before Jacob could question her further. He considered brushing it off, but some instinct deep inside wouldn't let him. Who was she, and how did she know things he'd never spoken aloud? Brooks Bistro was tucked behind fogged glass windows, its warm golden lights a stark contrast to the chilling rain outside. In a corner of the cafe, Eleanor Brooks was already seated, her silver hair neatly pinned up, a simple yet elegant black dress, and piercing blue eyes that studied Jacob as if she'd known him for years. "Jacob," she gestured for him to sit. "I knew your father through some business dealings. I know you're struggling to survive. I'm here to make you an offer. Marry me." The air seemed to solidify. Jacob laughed, thinking he'd misheard. But Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. "This isn't about love. It's a contract. I'll pay off your debts, take care of your mother and sister. In return, you become my husband, on paper." "Why me?" Jacob whispered. "Because you're young, unencumbered, and desperate enough to consider it." Her words cut through his pride like a knife. Jacob shot to his feet, furious, but deep in his chest her statement lodged itself like an arrow hitting its mark. That night when he told his mother, she didn't say much, just squeezed his hand, her voice trembling. "You don't need to love to save us. You just need to live." Jacob didn't sleep that night. The rain continued to patter outside, and before dawn he had his answer. A week later, Jacob Carter, a poor young man, became the husband of Eleanor Brooks. But as the gates of her mansion closed behind him, Jacob didn't realize that what he'd just stepped into wasn't a marriage but a labyrinth with no escape. The massive iron gate creaked and slowly swung open, revealing a cobblestone path winding between 2 rows of perfectly straight elm trees. The silver taxi rolled forward at a leisurely pace, its tires splashing rainwater onto the meticulously trimmed grass on either side. As pristine as if Jacob Carter sat in the back seat, clutching the strap of his suitcase, his heart pounding as if he were arriving not at a new home, but at a place that didn't belong to his world. The mansion came into view like something out of a fantastical dream or a veiled nightmare. Grayish-white, stone columns curved gracefully, the ancient tiled roof was covered in moss, and the large shuttered windows looked like blind eyes gazing down at the world below. Eleanor stood waiting at the top of the steps. Her black silk dress hugged her frame, her silver hair pinned up without a single strand out of place. "Welcome home, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth, as though Jacob were a guest or perhaps a new employee. The room assigned to Jacob was at the end of the second-floor hallway, spacious, fully furnished, everything so perfect it felt frigid. Not a single photograph, not a book, only the faint scent of lavender and an eerie, absolute silence. Standing in the luxurious space, Jacob felt small, like an object freshly packaged for display. At their first dinner, Jacob sat at one end of the long table, Eleanor at the other, the distance between them wide enough for 2 strangers to avoid meeting each other's eyes throughout the meal. The food was served by silent servants in black uniforms, moving like shadows. Each dish was a work of art, but Jacob couldn't swallow a bite. Where was he? "This house is really big," Jacob ventured, trying to break the silence. Eleanor sliced her meat with a silver knife. "You'll get used to it. Or you won't." Her words dropped onto the table like a pebble into a deep well. No echo, just a quiet sink into oblivion. After dinner, Jacob wandered through the long, dimly lit hallways. Portraits lined the walls, and faint golden light spilled from ceiling fixtures. But there were no voices, no music, nothing but the sound of his own footsteps echoing back. At the end of one corridor, Jacob paused before a dark wooden door, its brass handle intricately carved with strange floral patterns. The door was locked, but the floor in front of it was oddly free of dust. Someone still came and went from this place, despite the house feeling as though no one truly lived here. Jacob didn't know it, but that night, as he returned to his room, from somewhere behind that door, someone was watching him. The first days at the Brooks mansion passed like a sluggish dream, colorless, tasteless. Each morning, Jacob awoke in a room so perfect it bore no trace of life. Each evening he dined in absolute silence, the faint clink of cutlery against white porcelain, the only sound bridging the unbreachable distance between him and Eleanor Brooks. By day, the house exuded an air of antiquity and grandeur, but when night fell, all that remained was an emptiness that stretched on like an unending sigh. The thick walls seemed to hoard secrets, and the large windows appeared as though they'd never been opened. One night, Jacob couldn't sleep. He slipped out of bed and stepped into the hallway. The wall lamps cast a faint, ethereal glow across the polished wooden floor. There was no sound, no footsteps, but his own. Yet somewhere near the staircase leading to the basement, a faint noise emerged. Whispers. Jacob held his breath. He couldn't tell if it was human voices or the wind, but it had a rhythm, a cadence as if someone were speaking, whispering in the darkness. He crept down the stairs, his heart pounding. As he neared the kitchen, he spotted a dim light flickering from the laundry room beyond. The door wasn't fully closed. From within, a woman's voice emerged, low and firm. "He's not like the others before him. There's something strange." Another voice replied, softer, more hushed. "She never does anything. Without a reason, he's just another piece in her game." A chill gripped Jacob's stomach. He stepped back, careful not to make a sound, and retreated to his room as if he'd heard nothing. But from that moment, every glance, whether accidental or deliberate, carried a different weight. The next morning, while walking in the garden, Jacob encountered Mr. Harris, the elderly butler with pensive eyes. Summoning his courage, he asked, "How long have you worked here?" "Long enough to know silence is the best course." The man gave a faint smile, then walked away, leaving Jacob alone on the gravel path. That afternoon, while rummaging through the vast library, Jacob found a framed photo face down on a shelf. He turned it over and froze. In the faded old picture, a younger Eleanor stood between two men. One was Harold Brooks, her late husband. The other was Jacob's father. A shiver ran down his spine. The photo had no caption, no explanation, but one thing was certain: Jacob hadn't been chosen at random. That evening, as Jacob switched off his light to sleep, his door creaked open. Eleanor stood there. No knock, no words. The dim light illuminated her face, cold, expressionless. She stared at him for a long time, then stepped forward, placed a hand on his chest, and left as if she'd never been there. Jacob lay still, barely breathing, eyes wide open, fixed on the ceiling. From that night on, the house was no longer just silent. It began to whisper. The sprawling mansion was like a labyrinth that knew how to keep silent. Every hallway, every window, every wooden step seemed to hold the echoes of nameless footsteps, secrets never spoken aloud. Jacob gradually grew accustomed to the strange rhythm of life in the house. The long, silent meals, Eleanor with her mirror-like eyes that reflected others but never revealed herself, and the distant nods from the household staff, as if he were an outsider in a play with pre-assigned roles. One gloomy morning, with Eleanor out meeting business associates and the house submerged in icy stillness, Jacob decided to wander into the room she called her study, a place he'd always been forbidden to enter, without explicit reason. On the polished oak desk, amid stacks of papers arranged with emotionless precision, a small silver key lay quietly, as if waiting to be noticed. No label, no case, just a solitary key glinting under the desk lamp. Jacob's heart raced. He picked it up. The coldness spread through his palm. He knew it was wrong, but curiosity has a way of gnawing at reason, like a drop of water wearing away the same spot over time. That night, after everyone had retired to their rooms, Jacob slipped out of his bedroom. The key in his pocket thumped against his chest with every heartbeat. He traced the familiar hallway, stopping before the dark wooden door at the end, the one where days earlier he'd noticed the floor was strangely spotless. He inserted the key into the lock. Click. The sound rang out in the darkness like a point of no return. The door swung open with a weary groan, as if roused from years of slumber. The room inside was dusty but not decayed. There were chairs, a lamp, photographs. On a wooden table sat old, faded portraits in silver frames. A young Eleanor, a middle-aged man with glasses, Harold Brooks, and the other. Jacob froze. It was his father, Daniel Carter, but that wasn't all. On the table lay a stack of weathered files bound with a cloth tie. He opened them. Inside were transaction records between his father and Harold Brooks, failed business deals, unreturned sums of money, and at the bottom of the pile a handwritten letter, the ink smudged in places. You destroyed my family, left me with a broken man, a heart dying day by day. You didn't just kill my husband, you killed the last human part of me. Jacob felt as though the floor beneath him was trembling. On the desk, a marriage certificate bore the names Jacob Carter and Eleanor Brooks, dated 3 weeks before their wedding. Before he'd even met her, everything had been planned. Jacob gripped the paper, his hands shaking. Beneath the files was an old leather-bound journal, its first line scrawled in unsteady handwriting. This isn't love. This is justice, and he will be the perfect tool. Behind him, a breeze slipped through the cracked open door. It wasn't a breeze. A familiar voice cut through the air, cold and sharp as a blade. Curiosity can be deadly, Jacob. Jacob spun around. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her black velvet dress blending into the shadows, her eyes the only thing blazing, piercing through him like a slender dagger. No sound of footsteps. No knock. She appeared like a specter, or rather, like a guardian of trapped souls. You found it, she said slowly, without a trace of anger. Sooner than I expected. Jacob hid the papers behind his back, but she'd already seen them. Every line in the journal. The marriage certificate planned before he'd even stepped into that fateful cafe. The old files rimming with resentment. All of it. Why? Jacob's voice rasped out. Because of my father, you married me just to get revenge on him? Eleanor stepped into the room, closing the door behind her with a sharp click. Daniel Carter, she enunciated each syllable, as if chewing on a name that had been lodged in her throat for years. A con man in a businessman's suit, he earned Harold's trust, then took everything. She moved closer, but Jacob didn't step back. His heart pounded wildly, yet his gaze held steady. The age gap between them was no longer an advantage, just a divide between victim and avenger. He's dead, Eleanor. My father's gone too. Do you think trapping me in this gilded cage will bring you peace? Something flickered in Eleanor's eyes, perhaps a tremor, perhaps a crack in a wall too old to stand firm, but it lasted. Only a moment. She regained her composure. Not peace. Balance. Everyone must pay for their choices. Jacob clenched his fists. But I didn't choose this. Who am I in your story? A pawn, a breathing memory. Eleanor smiled, coldly. You're a reminder. The air turned to ice. Outside the window, rain began to fall, soft, persistent, like the whispers of forgotten souls. "You can't keep me here," Jacob said, his voice low. "I have the right to leave." Eleanor tilted her head. "Try it." Her words rang out like a challenge, and as Jacob left the room, his heart still hammering in his chest, he knew. He was no longer a guest in this house. He was a prisoner. That night, Jacob quietly packed his things. He planned to escape the mansion through the side door. But when he reached the garage, his old car sat there. The battery had been removed. The main entrance was locked from the inside. The security guard, spotting him, merely shook his head in silence. "Orders from the madam." Jacob returned to his room. The walls seemed to close in, no longer just brick, stone, and wood. They were invisible hands tightening around his freedom. He sank onto the bed, his face pale, cold sweat soaking through his shirt. In his pocket, the marriage certificate remained, proof of a loveless, freedomless union, a sentence signed in black ink and pain that had never dried. Jacob didn't know what he feared more, Eleanor, or the past he carried with him. The night wind swept through the hallway like cold fingers threading through hair, slipping under clothes, chilling to the bone. Jacob sat huddled on the stone steps behind the house, staring blankly at the shadows of trees cast on the wet grass. He no longer knew the time, only that this night stretched on too long, and he was truly trapped. Eleanor's words still echoed in his mind. Try it. He had tried, and failed. Cut off from escape, imprisoned by an invisible rule called power. But what frightened Jacob more than Eleanor herself were the shadowy corners of the story she was weaving, still unilluminated. The next morning, with Eleanor out meeting business partners, Jacob sought out the one person in the house who still possessed eyes capable of thought. Mr. Harris. The oldest, quietest, and seemingly most dangerous butler, Harris was watering white orchids in the garden. He didn't look up as Jacob approached. "You know I'm trapped here," Jacob said, cutting to the chase, "and I believe you know more than you've ever let on." A long silence followed. Only the gentle trickle of water and the rustle of dry leaves broke the stillness. "Do you think you're the first victim?" Harris replied, still not turning around. "No, but you might be the last." Jacob frowned. "What do you mean?" Harris sighed. "Eleanor used to be someone else, but pain has a way of turning people into the very thing they once feared most." He turned, meeting Jacob's gaze directly. "You're not just a tool for revenge. You're the remnant of a memory she can't forgive." Those words sent a chill down Jacob's spine. But in that moment, a faint glimmer flickered in the darkness. If Harris knew, if he was willing to speak, then Eleanor didn't control everything. That night, in his bedroom, Jacob opened his laptop. He called Peter Wallace, his best friend from law school. Under the guise of casual chatter, he posed a question. If someone were forced into a marriage under the pretense of a contract, but later discovered hidden motives, could it be annulled? Peter squinted through the screen. "Jacob, are you in trouble?" Jacob forced a smile. "Just hypothetically." Peter fell silent, but only for a moment. "Hypothetically, you'd need proof. Lots of it. The more specific, the better." Jacob nodded, and that night he began systematically searching Eleanor's study. Not just the journal or old files. He turned to the double-locked drawers, peeling back layers of paper, opening every envelope, and then he found it. A stack of new, unsorted documents. Investment contracts under the name Jacob Brooks Carter, stamped with Eleanor's company seal and multiple signatures, his own. He'd never signed them. Yet the handwriting was so eerily similar it sent a shiver down his back. In a smaller envelope was an unsent letter, addressed to Daniel Carter, his father. The script was old, furious, and chaotic. "You left me in ruins, now I'll rebuild. On the ashes of your family." Jacob dropped the letter, his hands trembling. Eleanor wasn't just using him for revenge. She was reconstructing her power, leveraging his name to legitimize everything, a living tool, both prey and mask. He was no longer Jacob Carter. He was Jacob Brooks Carter. A name rewritten, entwined, and on the verge of becoming legal identity inseparable from Eleanor Brooks. Stepping out of the room, Jacob looked up at the towering ceiling of the mansion. The gilded cage was no longer just a physical prison. It was a sophisticated legal shell, built from distorted love and a dream of vengeance fermented by power. And if he didn't act soon, he would vanish from his own life. The mansion seemed to breathe in rhythm with Eleanor, silent, authoritative, letting no sound escape the ears of its keeper. But Jacob was no longer the dreamer who had first stepped into this place. Within him now was a silent storm, not loud, but carrying the clarity of someone who had just glimpsed the edge of an abyss. The next day, beneath his neatly pressed shirt, Jacob concealed a USB drive containing every document he'd copied: the forged contracts, Eleanor's journal, the unsent letter, the marriage certificate laced with coercion. He left the house under the pretense of accompanying Eleanor to meet a business partner, but midway, he slipped away from the car and took a different taxi to Peter Wallace's office. Peter read through the files, stunned. "This is enough to take her to court, not just to court." Jacob clenched his fists. "But to reclaim my own identity." Peter nodded. They enlisted a private investigator to verify the signatures, uncovering that Eleanor had used Jacob's name in a series of investment deals tied to money laundering. He wasn't just a tool for revenge. He was a living shell for a shadowy scheme of enrichment. 2 days later, they submitted all the evidence to the authorities, and then Jacob returned to the mansion one final time, armed with a copy of the files and a readiness to confront her. Eleanor sat in the living room, draped in a red velvet robe like old blood, her eyes gazing into the garden as if fixed on something distant. She didn't turn as he entered. "Jacob," she spoke first, her voice soft as a breeze. "Have you dug deep enough yet?" "Deep enough to see. I was never a person to you, just a name that breathes." For the first time, Eleanor looked directly at him. No masks, no pretense. Only eyes exhausted beyond measure. "You were the sentence I passed on Daniel Carter, the remnant of a mistake I couldn't undo. And how many people have to bear the consequences of that mistake, Eleanor? Your husband is gone. My father is dead. But I'm still alive. I'm not anyone's ghost." Eleanor stood and approached him. "I didn't expect you to make me see myself in the way you fought back." "It wasn't fighting back," Jacob whispered. "It was saving what humanity I have left." The sound of police sirens pierced the air outside, slicing through the silence like a decisive cut. Eleanor froze. Looking at Jacob, she smiled, not with bitterness or mockery, but like a defeated soul who understood she'd gone too far. "You've won," she said, "but don't let hatred consume your heart as it did mine." She was escorted away, gently, as if she'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. Weeks later, at the trial, Jacob was called as a witness. He recounted everything, not with bitterness, but with the truth. And when Eleanor met his eyes from the defendant's seat, he nodded, not to forgive, but to close the chapter. The mansion was sold. Jacob used the proceeds to pay off his mother's and sister's debts. With the remainder, he established the Harold Brooks Scholarship Fund, named after the man who had become a victim in the unspoken war between 2 generations. One autumn afternoon, Jacob received an unmarked envelope. Inside was a single, familiar line: "Forgiveness didn't save me, but it saved you. Live on, with your heart intact." Jacob looked up at the sky. The autumn breeze was gentle, so was his heart. That spring, the Texas sky stretched high and clear as if washed clean after a long rain. In the small university courtyard, where young trees were just beginning to bud, Jacob Carter stood at the podium, clutching a thin sheet of paper bearing the name of a newly established scholarship fund, the Harold Brooks Foundation for Second Chances. Below him, young faces listened intently. None of them knew the full story behind the bold name etched on the plaque hanging on the wall. They didn't know about the locked doors, the forged contracts, the sleepless nights in a lavish yet frigid mansion. They didn't know Jacob had once traded his pride to save his family, only to later fight to reclaim himself, piece by piece, from the hands of a woman who had forgotten how to love. "This scholarship fund," Jacob said, his voice low and steady, "is not just an act of redemption, but a reminder even paths paved with pain can lead to a place of light." After the ceremony, he sat alone on a stone bench in a quiet corner of the courtyard. In his hand was an old letter, its paper yellowed, the slanted handwriting familiar. "Jacob, I spent my life avenging the past, so much so that I forgot how to step into the future. But you, with your kindness, with your courage that needs no shouting, reminded me that forgiveness isn't surrender. It's breaking free from the chains we forge ourselves. Don't be like me. Live with your heart intact. Eleanor." Jacob read each word as if it were a farewell, not from an enemy, but from a weary soul who had learned to step back before it was too late. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his chest pocket, carrying a piece of the past with him, not to harbor resentment, but to remember that all of us have lost our way at some point, and all of us deserve a chance to find our way back. As he walked away from the courtyard, a gentle breeze brushed his shoulder. Jacob looked up at the sky, unusually blue. No more burdens, no more knocks in the night, no more watchful eyes. Just the steady beat of his heart and a fragile yet resilient belief that he had emerged from the labyrinth, and this time on his own 2 feet.